So I'm going to talk about emotions in chatbots, basically, and of course we can extend this to sort of speech type of bots as well. And it's pretty much in the sentiment analysis book in the second edition, which is going to be published sometime later this year. So this is as an introduction. As a human beings, we are basically quite emotional, and we are affective beings, and the feelings, everything is basically part of our body, or part of our being, and somehow it's also related to our consciousness, I believe. And obviously, when we talk, we always thinking about the emotional intelligence. And when you speak to somebody, you should say in the right way. And you should try to detect what the emotion from that person, and also and how do you respond appropriately in order to make the conversation go smooth and go well. So the goal of this thing we are trying to do is essentially try to create chatbots which can perceive, obviously, to detect and also express emotions. And another part is also we want this system to learn continuously by itself. And of course, in this particular talk, I'm not going to touch that part, which is basically part of the lifelong or continual learning. And how do you make system to self-supervised learning, and in the process of conversations gets better and better. Okay. So my interest starts quite a while ago, and also because of my sentiment analysis interest in the past as well. And also everybody knows the chatbots gets quite popular in the past few years. And then obviously we want to see whether we need to do something to the chatbots, which is basically necessary. Okay. So this is the outline of my talk, and I'm going to talk about emotions and also definitions. I'm not talking about the dictionary definition. I'm sure everybody knows that. I'm going to talk about the more structured definition of the chatbots. And then in order to, not chatbot, but the emotions. And then I'm going to talk about the emotion expressions, because when you try to recognize emotions, you need to know what kind of expressions people use to express emotions. And then I'll talk about some HCR research, which is basically say emotion in chatting is necessary. Okay. Then I'll talk about a particular model, which is a deep learning model, which does sort of produce a little chatbot, which is can do some kind of emotional chatting. So I'm sure everybody knows there's a lot of disagreement in terms of definition and also what are the basic emotions of the humans. So lots of researchers give different kind of emotions. They regard those as a basic emotion, something. Some people think there's only two, some people think there's many, some people think that. So it's very difficult to come up with a consensus, even from the theorists. So this basically means what? Means it's very difficult and difficult to recognize. Even you recognize, other people may not agree with you. So this is basically one of the challenges. So another interesting thing about this emotions, there are lots of human emotions, and you can also group them into primary emotions, secondary emotions, and tertiary emotions. And of course, this kind of categorization, also not everybody agrees. And if you want to, if you have a practical application, you don't really have to follow whatever this researchers or this, basically most of the psychologists, they designed or they put together, and you can pick up whatever things you think is necessary or useful in your particular application, and just use those things, and don't really have to follow whatever they say. Okay, that's basically my my experience in the past. So in terms of definition, I'm going to give a definition in terms of a fairly structured way. So this is a tuple, and the first element of this tuple and the second element of this tuple essentially is the target. If you are familiar with emotion, the definition of emotion in terms of natural language way of expressing it is emotion. Normally you have a target. So you basically, with that target, you have emotion against that. And then of course you have emotion type, whether you're angry, you're happy, or you feel disgusted, or you feel surprised or fear or whatever things. And then also you have a feeler. So the person who feels that emotion, sometimes when you say a particular sentence, you may say somebody feels that emotion, not necessarily you. And then the next component is the cause. And emotion normally has a cause. And if you know the cause, then you be able to know how to respond properly. And of course, also you need to know the emotion type and how do you respond. All this together give you the information about the particular emotion. And then when you do the response, you should basically follow and also use this information to produce the response. The final component is the time, which is sometimes used for, but sometimes not necessarily used for. It's just the time when the person feels this emotion or the time this emotion was expressed. Especially in the social media, is probably the time when it's expressed. So if you see the example, I'm so mad with the hotel manager because he refused to refund my booking fee. So if you put this into that structure form, you will see the hotel is the first, it's the entity, and the manager is basically a particular aspect of the entity, and then the emotion is the anger, the feeler is I, is the person who the person is himself. Then the cause of this emotion, just the anger emotion, is basically says the person, the hotel manager refused to refund the fee, and the data is going to be the X. And when sometimes we want to combine the first one and the second together, we call it a target. So you can see with this kind of definition, you pretty much get all the components of emotion, and based on this, you can write whatever response you want to write in order to generate the response during the conversation. So there are lots of expressions we use, as human beings, we use to express our emotions. And we need to know this in order to detect the emotions or to perceive the emotions in order to produce the responses. So the first one is the speaker emotions. So the speaker emotions basically consist of different way the person speak, right? Paralinguistic kind of mechanisms such as intonations, facial expressions, and the body movement, and biophysical signals, for example, sweating, and blood pressure goes out, those kind of things. And the people also have the gestures and postures, all those things where you, this is pretty much very familiar to us. And when you have a robots, and the robots should also try to detect all these kind of things in order to gain a good understanding of what kind of emotion people have. Because normally when you use just the facial expression, which is not good enough, because many facial expressions basically you can't distinguish what emotion the person is actually expressing. And finally, of course, we also have a choice of grammatical and the lexical expressions, which I'm going to talk about later. And in writing, and in the past, we have been dealing with writing most of the time. We have never dealt with the speaker emotions, but obviously there's some research which are studying speaker emotions, essentially try to detect intonations of things to detect whether what kind of emotions being expressed by a person. So in the writing, you can use the punctuations, for example, exclamation marks, you use multiple of them. And then you also do this capitalization of all letters. Sometimes you get angry, you do that. And emoticons, which is very popular now, especially on cell phones, all those kind of things. And sometimes people are using listening of the words, and which is all those things are pretty frequently used in the social media. And again, we also have to worry about whatever the grammatical or lexical expressions or words and phrases we use, and which is also very important. For example, in linguistic expressions, we use for expressions for emotions, affects. Basically the words, right? Individual words we use, for example, the alarm, the disgusting, angry and upset, all those things are words definitely, and also the intensifiers. And I would say so happy, and also extremely something, and what on earth, and what the hell, this kind of stuff, which is very commonly used to express emotions. And also behaviors. This makes emotion detection also quite difficult, because sometimes you don't really say the emotion, you just describe what happened, or what kind of things have happened. He said he cried after he saw his mother. So obviously this is experiencing some kind of strong emotion. I don't know exactly what kind of emotion it might be. And also another thing is the superlatives. And this car is the best, simply the best. And pejoratives as well, this is the fastest. And the laudatory things is the saint and the sarcastic sentence as well. And the people when swearing, and the cursing, insulting, blame, all these things are normally expressing kind of strong emotions. So when you build an emotion detector, you got to consider all this kind of expressions in order to detect different type of emotions, and which is possible. It's not completely impossible. Okay, you can do fairly accurately, but of course, if you do traditional sort of supervised learning, it's going to be a bit more difficult. Okay, more difficult because you need a lot of training data, and this kind of all this type of expression not necessarily appears very frequently in your corpus. Another thing is also quite important is and there's a cognitive gap. When people feel a particular emotion, they may not say so. So the language they use and what they feel may not match. And of course, there are many reasons. I mean, sometimes just being polite, and you don't want, and also you probably don't want to know people, want people to know what kind of emotions you have. So which make detection difficult. And so what normally people do is you got to think about the context and put yourself into that person's shoes, and you try to predict what kind of real feeling he has. He may say, "I'm happy to see you," something like that, but not necessarily he was actually happy. So another thing is you need to use multimodal data to do this kind of detection, and which is quite popular research now. You use the images and use the text at the same time. Sometimes people even use movies and audio signals to detect what is actually the true emotion of the person. Okay. And and now I'm going to talk a little bit about this chatting is necessarily need emotions. That's because there are some HCR study, which basically human computer interaction research has done some researchers in those areas has done some research quite a long time ago, and says the emotion is very important in conversation, even in the communication with computers. Because just now I've been talking about all the things the human way of expressing emotions. But now what happens when you have a human and a computer? And so this is the area of this computer and the human computer interaction people would do. So psychology, which is of course the starting point, psychology argues that humans are affective beings, which basically means we are quite emotional. And also what is important is we also expect our emotional social needs will be addressed, which basically means when we say something, we expect that response to be also expressing. So essentially, the person who respond must answer, okay, must answer in the right way. And so this is the first question, which basically shows the emotional dialogue enhance the user satisfaction. So this was an experiment, and there was a quiz kind of experiment they did. And then they were using sort of lifelike characters, and which can do verbal and the nonverbal kind of expression of empathy, and then they play this kind of a quiz game. And they can show if you use that kind of empathy kind of a language, you can decrease the user's frustration and stress. And also you can actually encourage people to communicate with you more, and which is quite a positive thing to do. And so obviously this is basically says, and when you want to communicate with people, and even simple kind of situation, you should use emotions, empathies to have this communication. Another study which is also quite interesting, which says they did some experiments as well, say um, when we talk to a chatbot, and we sometimes we think this chatbot doesn't understand, I mean, make mistakes, but not they find out many years ago, they said that's not necessarily the most important problem, because they said that human beings make lots of mistakes as well. So the one of the major problem is, and when we have the conversation, we always have the expectations, and we expect the machine also sort of respond according to our expectation. If it deviates a lot from our expectation, then people get very upset. And people get sort of saying this is a stupid machine. I mean, it's always happened. We say this is a stupid machine. So, which basically means we need to detect and respond empathetically, and which can inspire the human user. So, which is quite, I heard from some companies, they build this kind of systems and they get exactly the same experience. So before they have this empathetical kind of chatbot, and then the customer, especially the customer service, and they get the conversations are always very short, and then they sometimes the user gets very upset. They change to the human sort of agent. But when you have this more emotional sort of chatting, and they cooperate much better, okay, much better. Again, it says in the dialogue system, and if you have emotional responses, you will lead to much fewer breakdowns in terms of a conversation. So this is the HCI research, and which is basically says, I mean, when we even do computer and the human communication, we need to do the same. It's not just the human to human communication. And another thing is, this is basically a challenge. When users say something, there are many possible ways to respond. So when a person says something, he's angry, but the person who responds can be happy, can be sad, it can be all kind of things, which create a problem when you want to build a good system to do this kind of emotional chatting. So for example, here is the user says the worst day ever, arrived late because of the okay, let's just say, for example, there's no emotion. The bot says you are late, right? And when say the bot feels happy, one could say, oh, this is depressing. Another one, disgust, and this traffic is getting worse and worse. And sympathetic, I'm sorry to know that you are caught in traffic. So this becomes a difficulty when you build a chatbot, because you need to know which one to use. And sometimes if you want to learn from the training data, and you may not be able to learn the right thing, because your training data may not be big enough. And sometimes if you get it
this is Seth. We seem to have lost Bing's audio for a moment there. Bing, you're back.
Oh, okay, I'm back. Okay. So is it okay now? Okay. So now I'm going to talk about a particular deep learning model, which is called emotional chatting machine. And this model is initial kind of attempt. It's not great yet. Not great yet. So when we start to build this thing, it was quite difficult in terms of a few things. The first thing is difficult to come up with the label data, and there's no such data now. Again, there's no such data, and we have to do some sort of fairly automatic way of annotate the data. And annotation becomes difficult. The reason is it's quite subjective, because many emotions they sort of conceptualize, they're overlapping. For example, disgusted and sad and anger. I mean, they are sort of related, right? They're not. It's sometimes even more very difficult for human beings to figure it out. And when you do the generation, it's not easy to balance the emotion and the grammars and also the content at the same time. So the model has to be fairly sophisticated in order to consider all these kind of situations. So we have end-to-end model to generate responses. When somebody says something, I want to generate with a suitable emotion and also the right content. The system is called the emotional chatting machine, which is short for ECM. Okay, ECM. So what is the definition? Definition essentially is this is the problem definition. The user gives the utterance, and which is called X, and it's a sequence of words. And then also in this early work, we requires an emotion category in terms of response. You want this response to be angry, or you want to be disgust, or you want to be happy, all those things. And the goal is to generate a response Y, which is again is a sentence with a list of words, and by estimating the probability. Okay, estimating probability given the X and the E, we want to generate the Y. Obviously, we want to have the highest probability, and then when we do the sampling of the words, So if you look at the probability here on the right-hand side, it will be the E and the X, and also all the words before it, and then generate the next one and the next one. Okay, then times them together. Okay, times them together. Essentially, this is the objective function. So this is a encoder, a decoder framework in the general sequence-to-sequence model. Obviously, we have to add some stuff inside to make it in order to consider the emotions. So the first thing is this model is based on the GRU, and which is essentially generate giving an input X, and then we generate a hidden state, essentially the representation. Okay, representation. And then this is going to be decoded. It's decoded into the response. Okay, into the response. The X is come from the user, and the S is going to be that state. And then we're going to append the previous word, the general word, and the context. The CT is that little context. The context is an attention model. It's an attention model on the important part of the user's the utterance. The utterance. Essentially, that's another model which is trying to detect what part of the user's utterance are important. And then we're going to generate the next state. And based on the next state, okay, and we're going to have some kind of output probabilities. And then based on that probability, we're going to sample a word and the generated output in the individual to generate the sentence word by word. Okay, word by word. Okay, so here is the process. And the process is from left to right. The first thing is do the classification, emotion classification. Of course, we need to know what the user's emotion was, and then we have the training data with the emotion attached, and this is the post. Post is the user's post. This is the training data. The post means that from user, the response is of course is also from the user. This is the training data, but in the test time, we get a post, and then the system has to generate the response. Okay, this is the training data, and the ECM is the model in the middle, and which is basically was a decoder, encoder, decoder kind of framework. And then we have the emotion embedding and the internal memory, external memory, and then we generate the bottom part will be the generated sentence. When you give a different emotions, you're going to generate different kind of sentences with that kind of emotions embedded inside that sentence. Each emotion category, basically those are anger, happy, those things are emotion categories, and will be represented by embedding. And real value it's a sort of low dimensional vector. It's not so much. It's basically 100-dimensional vector, and that is trained during the process. After that is trained, we're going to add that to the words. Okay, to the words, which is you look at the bottom equation. So you can see this part has the user's sentence, the CT, which is the important part of the user's information, user's utterance information, and those are the previous words being generated, which is the E basically we're producing embedding of that thing, together with the emotion category we give. And then this is going to produce the state, the ST, again, ST. And then this is going to be decoded, okay. So that's the component which is the internal memory of the emotion state, okay. So what does that mean? Essentially means when we try to express a sentence, when we try to say a sentence, normally we already have something in your mind, what kind of emotion in your mind. And in the process of generate that sentence, the emotion actually goes with the sentence. Okay, goes with the sentence. And then the emotion and it goes with the sentence. When you finish that sentence, that emotion ends. Okay. So which basically means we need to decide at what time we're going to choose some emotional word to express our emotions. And then this process gets decayed. And then when you reach the end, then emotion, or when the sentence is finished, basically says emotion is ended. Okay, ended. Again, I'm not gonna explain this. There's no time to explain this thing because it's quite complicated. There are two gates, and essentially, this one I described is basically track the state of the emotion goes from the first word to the last word in the generated sentence. Okay. So we also need the external memory. So external memory, what is this external memory? It's basically the vocabularies. So in the emotion, sort of emotion expressions, there are special kind of words. Most of them are quite special words, and then we need to store it somewhere. And that storage is called external memory. Of course, we also have other words stored in the external memory as well. So in order to decide for the next word, what do we generate? Are we going to generate an emotion word? Are we going to generate sort of general words, basically the content words? Okay, content words. Then we have loss function here, emotion, softmax, and also the generic softmax. This is basically for other words. And then the type selector. Essentially, this is going to be a probability and which side, right? You're going to probability on the emotion side or the probability on the content word side, and this whole together basically decides what's the proportion of the thing we are going to generate. And then this is combined together and give us a value. I'm going to based on that to that probability vector to do the sampling to generate the next words. Okay, generate the next words. And obviously, this is more complex.
Bing, we have a short dropout in your audio again.
Hello?
Yes, you're back.
Okay. So
we've lost you again.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Essentially, is try to store those words which are basically with the emotions. Those words, and those words are, for example, happy or the same type of things. And then we need to have the emotion and also generate word softmax to figure out probability. Okay, which side should I, for this particular word, which one should I choose, and what is the proportion? And based on that, we compute the probability, and with that probability, we can do the sampling of the next word. Okay, next word to produce to generate that next word. So this is just some evaluation. And since we, as I mentioned earlier, we don't really have a dialogue data with emotion annotations. And then what we do is somehow we have to generate that, and we have to create one. And what we do is we use another data set which has emotion annotations, but that is not a dialogue data set. And train with that guy to produce an emotion classifier. The emotion classifier. I use the bidirectional LSTM. and that does not give a super accuracy. I mean, part of the reason is also because the emotion classification is pretty tough. If you want to classify, if you want to build a classifier for emotions, let's say 6 or 8 categories, you pretty much get 60-something%, and the most you can get 70%. It's very difficult. And the user classifier, we can annotate the data, which is called STC. It's a dialog data set. And based on that, we can get this kind of data in the training data, and validation data, and the test data. And you can see the number of different kind of categories of emotions, and also the number of posts, over there. And then this is an evaluation. We have different kind of evaluation, but I just show you one evaluation is the human evaluation. What it does is basically ask a human to give a rating. The content, will this respond, the content is good or not, 0, 1, and 2, and emotion is correct or not correct. Is it good or not? Okay, it's good or not. And you can see we have 2 baselines. This is the normal sequence to sequence. Another one is the embedding, which is very simple as well. You just basically add an emotion embedding into the input, not into the hidden state, and then you use that to generate. So obviously, a system with more mechanisms produce a better result, especially in those good contents and the good emotions categories. The first column, actually the second column, and the third column, you can see some improvement. Okay. But this is the problem, which is quite tough. Okay, so just only 27%. So many of them are not quite right. Not quite right. Okay, finally, and I don't have time left, and I'll just give a summary. Basically, I believe chatting with emotions is really quite vital to dialogue systems. And I just discussed a model, as you can see, and the quality is not ready for prime time. It's still pretty inaccurate, actually. And if you look at the actual data, it's still not great. And we probably need more better classifiers, and also, of course, the generators. However, in practice, there are already systems which is in practical use, which has emotions, but they are mostly written in rules. They are not really deep learning trained models, unless you are working on a very narrow domain. Just now I mentioned what I described. That model is for general chatting, which is basically chit chat, which is basically can cover anything in the world you can chat, which is a lot more difficult. So now the practical application, those chatbots, which with some emotional sort of capability in the customer service and also companion kind of, and they're already in the market. And of course, another things we have not talked about are the moods and also other feelings, because the mood is another thing, especially when you're dealing with old folks and also with companions. You need to detect the moods of the people in order to be able to talk to the person, and in the long term, not just one particular moment. Emotions basically talk about something in a particular moment. Okay, and that's basically about it. Thank you very much. Any questions?